Hey guys, and welcome to PowerPoint 15. This one's titled Life in the Territory. So we had a pretty long PowerPoint last week of a lot of different things we discussed. We kind of left off with how New Mexico were treating the Native Americans and what was happening in the territory at the time. So our first slide here is talking about New Mexico as a territory. So New Mexico experienced great change as a territory. New cultures and people began arriving, mostly from the United States. People from the East Coast were arriving into New Mexico. One, because it was one of the pathways to California. People were trying to get to California, and traveling through New Mexico was part of that. So most came to New Mexico by way of the Santa Fe Trail, then traveled on the old Spanish Trail to California. A new trail opened to California called Cook's Wagon Road. It was one of the first wagon routes connecting New Mexico to California. So these are some of the different routes that you could take whenever you were leaving New Mexico, headed into to California, and just the different ways to get to California at the time. Okay, and in 1858, the Butterfield Overland Trail opened from Missouri to San Francisco. It took 25 days to travel. People were trying to get from the East Coast to California. That was just something that they wanted to do. California was very desired at the time. The California Gold Rush had just happened within the last decade, and people wanted to be there. California was growing. So stagecoaches were dangerous and uncomfortable. Also, outlaws and Indians often attacked the stages. So when people were traveling west, it wasn't just like you travel today where you get in your own private car and you just cruise along. No, you were threatened by Native Americans attacking you, outlaws attacking you, robbing you, killing you. I mean, it was a dangerous, dangerous journey to travel from the East Coast to California. And through New Mexico or the Plains area, there was a lot of different types of threats along the way. Not to mention sickness and weather and all the natural things that you could possibly be threatened from. So, territorial growth. New Mexico's population tripled between 1850 and 1900. So in the 50 years there, a lot more people started arriving in New Mexico. People from the east started moving into New Mexico. Texans continued to move into New Mexico. So as you start having more people arrive in the territory, there is no longer this overwhelming where New Mexico is majority of the Spanish population. People are starting to arrive that are not just of Spaniard descent or Mexican descent. So people came in hopes of finding gold or cheap land. New Mexico was popular for its mining, for its beaver trading, for a lot of things like that. And plus, there wasn't a lot of people who had settled along the outskirts of Santa Fe. So it was inviting for people off the East Coast that wanted their own land. Some came to escape religious persecution or bullying because of their religion. Some arrived here because they couldn't survive on the East Coast and they wanted to be different. They wanted to get away. So, religion in New Mexico. At the time, Catholicism, or the Catholic religion, was very, very popular. So, New Mexico experienced many religious changes as a territory. New Mexico's first bishop was Jean-Baptiste Lamy. He arrived in 1851 with new ideas and goals for the Catholics of New Mexico. So, like I said, Catholicism was the number one religion in New Mexico, and a lot of it depended on these Catholic churches that were set up in support of the New Mexico, of what New Mexico, how New Mexico was established with missionaries and different things like that. So, Bishop Lamy built 45 new churches and the St. Francis Cathedral in Santa Fe. So as religion was pushed in New Mexico, Catholicism was something of old world Spain, okay? And a lot of the people that were arriving in New Mexico from the East Coast were not Catholics. So it was kind of a conflict, but Catholicism was still very popular in New Mexico. So Bishop Lamy also brought priests and nuns to New Mexico. They opened new schools and hospitals like St. Vincent's Hospital and St. Michael's High School. St. Michael's High School still exists today, and so does St. Vincent's Hospital. So some of the things that they established 150 years ago still exist today. Not the same buildings, but definitely the same names and locations. Okay, so religion was very popular in New Mexico. It was something that a lot of people showed up and because of. Next, we have land policies. So here we have a little picture of some people who obviously were traveling by wagon, and this was very common. You load up your whole family and you head west in hopes of finding new land or a new place to call home. And if you made it and survived, that was a feat in itself. But oftentimes you lost family members along the way to either diseases or sickness or maybe even outlaws or in Native Americans. And a lot of the reason they came here was because at one time the federal government owned most of the land in the West. To encourage people to settle in the West, the government created the Homestead Act. It gave 160 acres of free land to any person who agreed to live on the land for 5 years and improve it. Well, improving it meant farming it or building some kind of structural home on it or something along those lines. Improving it where people wanted to live there even if you left or whatever. So, people were overly excited to head west to receive a portion of the Homestead Act. You just have to live there for 5 years, and you have to improve the land, and then the land's yours. So you don't even have to pay for it. However, many found it too difficult to farm in eastern New Mexico. So you think about where we live today. There's not a lot of rain. There's not a lot of moisture. It's pretty rare. If you do not have irrigation, water wells, sprinklers, something along that line to water your crops, your crops probably aren't going to survive. Or if you're not living next to a water source, such as a river or a lake or a stream or something like that, which we know the closest river to us is Fort Sumner's River, which is the Pecos River. And so it was just too dry. It was too dry for farming to work here. So they were forced to leave their land behind. A lot of people started farming, tried it for a couple of years and said, I can't do this. This isn't worth my time, and we're not going to survive. And so they never received their 160 acres for the Homestead Act. So a lot of land in New Mexico was abandoned after just a few short years. So making a living in New Mexico, if you actually did survive, it probably wasn't because of farming. Sheep and cattle ranching were among the biggest businesses in the territory. Mining and growing city stores were also good businesses. All of these businesses were helped by the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s. So between the 1850s, when New Mexico became a territory, and the 1880s, the railroad started growing. Remember, they wanted the Gadsden Purchase, which was the southern part of New Mexico, for the railroad to travel through there because that was going to be a great place to build the railroad. So as the railroad started growing and connecting the coast to coast, more people started arriving in a safer atmosphere and establishing businesses that were going to help and not just because they wanted a piece of land. So sheep ranching was the number one livestock market in New Mexico until the late 1800s. Sheep were very, very popular because it was easy to harvest sheep. And I say harvest when I say you sheared their wool and you sent their wool to market. You didn't actually kill the sheep and consume them. You just used their wool was the way to farm sheep or harvest sheep. Cattle ranching became popular after the Civil War. So in the 1870s, cattle ranching became popular, and when the railroad connected the United States, because then cattle were used for obvious reasons, for consumption, for eating. And so whenever they were able to use the railroad to ship cattle on, yes, they did put cattle on trains back then, and they drove them there and put them on the trains, and they were shipped to market, and they were butchered and distributed. And so cattle ranching became popular when it was easier to transport cattle on the railroad. All right, so cattle drives and cowboys. So that leads us into cattle drives and cowboys. Until the railroad came to New Mexico in the late 1880s, ranchers had to find a way to get their cattle to market. So if you had cattle, you couldn't just call the local trucker and say, hey, come pick up my cattle and load them up and haul them to market. No, you had to drive your cattle to market, which was usually hundreds and hundreds of miles. which was a long journey, and it took a lot of cowboys, and it was very dangerous because stealing cattle was a very common thing. Cattle drives became the answer. Cowboys drove thousands of cattle over long distances. So the picture that you can see inset behind this is a group of cowboys sitting there ready to take cattle to the market. And the Goodnight Loving Trail became the main cattle drive in New Mexico. It went through eastern New Mexico into Colorado. It actually went rather close to where we are located here in Melrose, and they watered in portions south of Melrose and then over towards towards Fort Sumner, and it was a popular route, and people traveled that to take their cattle north to market. A typical cattle drive took 4 months with 15 cowboys and 2,000 head of cattle. 4 months. 4 months of living on the ground. 4 months of sleeping in a sack, of eating food that can only be cooked by the fire, which probably was more like biscuits and beans, and 4 months of probably being away from your family and all those things. That's a long time. That's a long time to be on a cattle drive. If you've ever camped out in a tent, it's worse than that. So being a cowboy was dangerous. They had little sleep and rough elements. But cowboys were very, very popular. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy. Cowboys were kind of the outlawed thing of the time, the Wild West, so to speak. They carried guns. They were skilled horsemen. They were cowboys. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy in the late 1800s. And so it was that's why there's westerns today, western movies, because they depict these cowboys, which are something, I mean, the Wild West times, or what you would consider the late 1800s, are a very unique time as well. Okay, so next slide is talking about the railroad. So cattle drives came to an end when the arrival of the railroad. Cattle could now be shipped on the rail. So I talked about this a couple slides ago. When they no longer had to drive their cattle thousands of miles or hundreds of miles to get their cattle to market, they could just drive them maybe a few hundred miles or 100 miles to get them to the railroad, and then put them on a railroad car, and they would be shipped to market. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was the first railroad company to build tracks into New Mexico. So it actually built tracks right here to Melrose and Clovis. In fact, Melrose was the destination of supposedly the big depot for the railroad. However, it didn't have great access to the southern route. So when Melrose was created, it was actually, the first original name of Melrose was Brownhorn, and it was the Brownhorn Railroad Depot. And when it was created, they had to back it up. They had to back up and put a depot, which is now Clovis, because it had better access to all the different branches of the railroad. And the railroad grew around Clovis. Clovis grew around the railroad, and Clovis boomed and grew big, and Melrose just kind of stayed a small little village. So had they kept the huge depot at Melrose, Melrose might be bigger in size than it is today, or at least it would be maybe Clovis's size, and things would be a lot different. So more than 3,000 miles of track were built in 1880 to 1915. So a lot of railroad track was built during that time. The railroad connected New Mexico, brought in people, machinery, and equipment. As the industrial revolution started happening, where cars and machines and things were created, and all these different advancements in technology were happening, they were through the railroad, they were being able to be brought into the West, which was in New Mexico. So New Mexico wasn't lacking in that technology at the time. Okay. So our next slide, mining and tourism. So boom towns, are towns that sprang up quickly around mining, grew quickly around towns centered around mining. So New Mexico was pretty popular for mining, and oftentimes there would just be a town that just sprung up because there was gold found or silver found or copper or something along those lines. And that created boom towns, or very quickly outbursts of towns. Turquoise, copper, and coal were New Mexico's top mining industries. Tourism grew into one of New Mexico's largest businesses. Tourists came to see the Southwest cultures and Indian pueblos. So New Mexico was a bit of a mystery to a lot of people on the East Coast because a lot of them grew up not knowing any Native Americans, had not seen the culture, and New Mexico was relatively young at the time in the late 1800s. There were still Native Americans everywhere. There were still pueblos everywhere. And so people wanted to see it. People wanted to see the Wild West. People wanted to see what was happening. Some people came to New Mexico for health issues. People were diagnosed with tuberculosis or TB, were sent to New Mexico for the dry air and climate to help with the fluid that filled their lungs. So tuberculosis is a lung disease. Oftentimes, people with tuberculosis are considered to be called lungers, and it is where your lungs basically have fluid on them all the time, and so they would come to New Mexico to try to dry out that fluid because New Mexico has such a dry climate and dry atmosphere. So all along the railroad, hotels and restaurants grew rapidly to support the tourism and people traveling on the railroad. So as the railroad grew, people started showing up, and New Mexico started kind of booming and taking off in the late 1800s. And that kind of led to New Mexico growing. And New Mexico wanting to be part of the United States even more. So, that's our last slide for this week. So make sure you're taking good notes. You are writing down all the information that you are that's written on these slides. You're keeping track of that, and you are making sure that you are answering all your questions that with your notes and not Googling them. So if you have any questions, message me, and I'll see you guys in the next PowerPoint.